You start to believe that money is bad. There are issues with capitalism without any guardrails on.
Kyle Thiermann here. I'm in Cape Town.
I was the only journalist in northern Nigeria.
Not an adventure until you get lost in Tijuana.
If you get caught inside by a giant wave, you feel really alone.
I love the adventure of waking up and not knowing what will happen and that being my job.
Kyle Thiermann Show.
Kate Williams, thank you so much for coming on the show. Before this conversation starts, but just in case there was any great snafu in my my bio, so what is 1% for the Planet, for people who do not know?
1% for the Planet is a global nonprofit organization that has created a model in which businesses can commit to giving 1% of their revenues to environmental partners. And we facilitate the whole kind of chain of that, from engaging members to certifying their donations to vetting the partners.
Okay. And how did this get started?
We were founded, as the story goes, on the riverbanks of the Madison River in Montana by Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia, and his buddy Craig Matthews, who founded a company called Blue Ribbon Flies. And they were fishing, as they like to do, and they basically realized that the give back that they were each doing with their companies was great, but it kind of didn't matter if it was just these individual companies doing this thing, that the important thing was collective action and getting more people involved. And so they created the idea for 1% for the Planet was born on that riverbank fishing trip. And we were created as the movement builder to create the way that other companies could join in so that we could add up the 1% commitments of many companies so that it started to matter at scale.
And at scale, how much has 1% for the Planet donated to date?
Yeah, that's the exciting question, because from that kind of pretty, humble beginnings, we have now grown to a lifetime certified impact as of basically right now, more than $700 million US. And last year alone, we certified $100 million US. And we're on track and really accelerating towards our first $1 billion in, total lifetime giving, and then getting to the next billion more quickly from there as we continue to grow.
And is this revenue all from 1% of total revenue of companies, or is there other revenue coming in?
No, it's all from that 1%. There's a little bit of, I should correct myself. There's a little bit currently, and this may grow, we hope it will grow, of additional revenue coming from our Planet Impact Fund, which is a new product that we created, which is a way for donors who may not be members. It's available to members as well, but it's a way for donors who are not members to give into a fund that's invested for positive impact, and then we grant annually. So any new donations or investment returns, investment gains on that Planet Impact Fund also count toward our certified impact. We just launched that in 2022. So, relative to the, total C of the, 700 million, it's, remains kind of a drop still, but we hope to see that stream growing for sure.
And how does it work on a nuts and bolts level? So let's say that I'm the director of a local nonprofit group in California trying to protect a local river. Will I then reach out to 1% for the Planet for a grant, and then you determine if the work that our nonprofit is doing is aligned with the goals of 1%? How does that? How does the money actually change hands?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, just one quick sidebar in that's a great example too, because we're pretty sure that the very first 1% gift made by Patagonia before it was even creating 1% for the Planet was to a small river-focused nonprofit in California. And we think it was a $6 donation. So things have grown since then. But the way it works is we don't operate as a foundation. So 1% for the Planet doesn't actually take in that total 1% and distribute it. So I actually might sort of start the example on the company side just to follow the money from there. So the way it would work is that a business would join, and they would, during the course of the 12-month year, it's based on their fiscal year, they would, project their revenues, kind of probably roughly figure out what they would give. But then at the end of their first year, they would know their actual revenues, and they could have done some giving over the course of the year, but at the end of that year, they would need to true that up. And we would work with them throughout that to help them to figure out, who do you want to give to? What are you trying to solve for? What's your strategy? What's the brand story that you want to tell? How do you want your employees to be able to be involved? We have a whole kind of matrix of questions. And then we would help the company to find the nonprofit partners that were a good fit for them. And then through that, they would, sometime during the 12 months, sometimes it's all at the end, sometimes they do it sort of over time, the company would make those donations directly to the nonprofits. And then at the end of the year, we have a period of time where we do certification. And so the members, the company, would need to provide documentation of the giving that they did. They would also need to provide documentation of their revenue. And then essentially we do the math and we make sure that the giving is 1% of that total revenue. And then when we've completed that, we celebrate. It's awesome to have certified. And then a new year begins and the company starts all over again. And we have many members who are doing it year over year over year because they really build it into their budget and kind of how they think about marketing, how they think about operations, et cetera.
Okay. So what is the criteria of nonprofit that you will recommend? So what I'm learning right now is that 1% is more of a conduit between nonprofits and for-profit business, and you then help direct that revenue to the best nonprofit that fits with the marketing goals of the brand. What are nonprofits that you would work with? What are nonprofits that you would not work with?
Yes, it's a great question because, alongside that process that I just described, we have a whole vetting process for our nonprofits. And really the kind of meeting ground for the businesses in the nonprofit is our 4 impact areas, which are just economies, resilient communities, rights to nature, and conservation and restoration. And we built those thinking about, how can we push out the boundaries of the definition of environmental, because we really have a planet and people point of view. So we use the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Project Drawdown, kind of other learnings that we have had over our many years, and just about 4 years ago put in place those 4 impact areas. And then we have a set of eligibility criteria underlying those, a few of which are just sort of functional. Is it a nonprofit in good standing? In the U.S., 501c3 or C4 is fine. In other countries, there are other, particular tax codes. So we refer to them as environmental partners just because it is such a broad set of charitable organizations. Because there are so many, we actually don't have an open application for nonprofits. They either need to be recommended by staff. So we may see we have a gap in a particular issue area, or a company may say, here's what I'm looking for, and we go find it. Or sometimes companies recommend them. They're saying, hey, I'm in, this small corner of the world, and there's this, awesome small nonprofit that you may never have heard of, but I'd like to give to. And we're saying, great, recommend it. And then we can put it through our process. So by the time a nonprofit gets approved through our process, they've all been through the same vetting process.
Mm-hmm.
And then really from there, there's some subsequent steps where we just ask for more and more information. It's a pretty knowledge-based approach because, as you correctly noted, the goal is best fit, not best in the world, because for each company, there's going to be a best fit nonprofit that helps them to meet their particular goals. So in order to find best fit, we have to understand and know a lot about the nonprofit. So that's what we're always after.
Sure. And is it typical that a brand, let's say you're a brand doing $100 million a year in revenue, that you would then give 1%, $1 million to a single nonprofit? Or is it more common that there's a range of nonprofits that the brand would give a bit to?
It varies, but I would say for the most part, particularly for the bigger companies, they do break it out to some different nonprofits. But a lot of times we see the kind of trend is that a new company might start with a lot of nonprofits and then narrow it down to a smaller set, just as they kind of hone what are the best relationships and partnerships and kind of what serves them best. Because kind of like any relationship, you sometimes have to just test the waters a little bit.
Okay. So pitch me. Let's say I'm the founder of a company that's a unicorn, just skyrocketing, and I business is going great. Like we have a kick-ass marketing team. Our customers love us. Why should I get involved with 1% for the planet if things are going well with the current strategy that our business is employing?
Yeah. So, Kyle, it's so great that you're interested in 1% for the planet, and I'm psyched to just share a little bit with you about that. And really, what I would say is probably the way that you have been able to grow, as you clearly have grown, is by making smart investments in the right assets. So you've invested in good staff, you've had good talent investment, you've invested in the right kind of infrastructure to enable you to grow. And one of the really important things that I think is an opportunity that you could move into is investing in kind of the core asset that is key to any, ability to have a future economy or certainly a future thriving business, and that is the planet. And so what 1% for the planet represents is a way for you to make that investment in a smart way that is aligned with your particular strategy, your brand, addresses problems that you may want to solve. A rapidly growing company may have employee engagement challenges. I don't know if that's true for you, but we have learned that 1% for the planet is often a really good strategy there. So all to say, I think what I would, invite you to see is 1% for the planet is kind of the asset, the opportunity to invest in the asset that you haven't yet been investing in. That's a huge opportunity.
So what's a great success story of a brand who has come to 1% for the planet, been aligned with one of your nonprofit partners, and been able to tell a great story around that?
Yeah, I appreciate getting this question, and it's always the hardest question because it's kind of like, which of the thousands of great partnerships should I pick? So I'll spin the wheel, and I would say, a great one that I would describe is one between Toad & Co., who's a sustainable apparel brand based just north of you in Santa Barbara. And they have a partnership with a nonprofit was originally not one that was included in our network. It's a mental health and sort of more social side of the spectrum nonprofit. But over the years, as we got to know them and some of what they were working on together and some of the experiences that they were creating Toad & Co. and this nonprofit for their partners, we brought them in because they were engaging, people of all different abilities and opportunities to experience the outdoors. And that connection to the outdoors is what builds advocacy and engagement. And we saw that was really clear. And in terms of our 4 impact areas, that was a really good fit. And so Toad & Co. has been involved with this nonprofit now for many years, and their giving has increased as part of the 1% commitment. So that's a really important story. They've brought in a whole new audience, and I was able to go and speak at one of their events, and there was really awesome opportunities for kind of engaging a new audience to think about environmental giving. And then the last thing I would share is they also are now exploring ways that as Toad & Co. transitions into a new ownership model, they can bring this nonprofit into the kind of shareholder table. So some really innovative ways. So the reason I share that example is just because it showcases so many great ways in which our thinking about environmentalism has evolved to be still rigorous and inclusive, while also sort of showing the way that these long-term relationships can create a lot of different possibilities for both the nonprofit and the company itself.
Okay. Do you find that publicly traded companies engage with 1% for the planet differently? Because, as famously done by Patagonia, right, rather than sell and become a publicly traded company, which would theoretically limit their ability to make financial decisions that do not benefit their quarterly profits. They decided to restructure the business, with the famous tagline, "The Earth is our only shareholder." Um, for a lot of businesses, their goal is to sell, and the founders tend to become fabulously wealthy when those exits occur, and they, buy an infinity pool on top of an infinity pool and never work again. But what happens then is that you no longer own the business. You can no longer make those kinds of decisions as easily. How have you found that publicly traded companies, these are, they tend to be the biggest ones, engage with 1% for the planet? Can they? Is it something that the board of directors, it needs to encourage? Like, how does it work if you were to work with a publicly traded company that is, not just doing $1 billion, but like doing $20 billion? The behemoths of the world.
Yeah, it's an important question because it helps give some good insight into sort of who our network is. And, I will say, like, the majority of our network is privately held for, the kind of inverse reasons of all of what you've just decided. There's more sort of independent decision making, kind of easier to move that forward. That said, we do have a couple publicly held companies, and we feel that that's such an important piece of the model because, really those companies and our work with them helps to make the case for the fact that this isn't a sort of trade-off decision. It's not about, do I do the right thing for the planet or do I do what's right for my business? These are the companies that are really proving it's good for business and good for the planet at the same time. So, we still have, continued storytelling to do to like help more companies to see that. But OXO is a great example. They're a housewares company, a large brand owned by Helen of Troy, so they're publicly traded. And they're a great member. They're very engaged, super thoughtful about their giving, and they continue to be a member. And the only reason a publicly held company can continue to be a member is if they're seeing not only does it, have that sort of value lift, but it also, is a lift for the business. So I think it's a great question and one that we really continue to want to, tell the story about because it does, again, I just want to really emphasize it's about what's good for the planet is also good for business.
I want to talk about greenwashing. And I think that one thing that's really attractive to me about 1% for the planet is that it operates on a percentage basis, not either a dollar amount basis or a just kind of obtuse, we give to this cause. Like, hey, by the way, we're $1 billion company and we donated $6,000 last year and we're going to slap this all over our marketing. I work as a marketer. Like I get to look under the hood of many companies, and I always encourage them to tell the truth because sooner or later it comes back to bite you. But I've been amazed at how many brands put some kind of giving front and center in their marketing, and then if you really drill down into the numbers that they're giving versus the benefit that they're getting from the storytelling aspect of this philanthropy, it is very misaligned. It would be the equivalent of the average person just donating 10 cents a year to their cause of choice and then branding themselves as a big giver. You really can't do that when it's on a percentage basis. You feel that at the end of every fiscal year. But greenwashing exists. And without an organization either calling them out or customers calling them out, many of these companies are able to just skate by on that marketing, and no one is looking under the hood to do that due diligence. What are your thoughts on greenwashing generally, and how can we combat this?
Yeah. Starting from the 1% for the planet side, just to, because we think of ourselves and we are the opposite of greenwashing. So not only is it the percentage, it's percentage of revenue, which is even more solid, because that's not a debatable number once the books are closed for a year. That's, so it's not profit, it's revenue. And then we're the third party, so it's
Sorry,
certified.
would you mind just explaining this for people
Sure.
who,
Yeah.
who maybe don't understand the difference between profit and revenue?
Yeah, absolutely. So another word we could slot in for revenue is sales, which is, accurate for most companies, but it's basically it is the top line income that you bring in. And so that's an objective number. It's, if you sold 10 things for $1, your revenue would be $10. And there's no way to change that. Whereas your profit is the what happens at the end of the year once you net out any expenses. So you could say we spent $8, so we only have, $2 of profit. But then sometimes people are like, well, maybe we should just like spend a little more this year on XYZ so we don't show quite as much profit. So there's a little more monkeying around that can happen with profit, which is not,
Company parties. Yeah, let's do a
exactly.
$1 million company party and write it off.
And it's not all bad, but it's just,
Yeah.
sometimes it is, a little bit, underhanded, but it's not like it's all bad, but it is something that can be kind of tweaked, whereas revenue is revenue or sales is sales. So, so that I think is an important distinction and that was very important to both Yvonne and Craig at our founding is like, it's gotta be a real number and also like you may have a year that's not a great year and you can't just say, oh, we didn't make any profit, so we're not going to give anything. It's really baking it in so that you're committing to investing in that core asset, regardless, because even if you have a tough year, you're still having an impact. The planet still needs our support. So, it really is quite a high and important bar. And our members feel really proud of that and committed to that, even as they sometimes feel challenged by that. But so that's an important piece of it. And that is, one of the ways in which it's the opposite of greenwashing because it's a super solid number. And then the other piece is that it's a third party. It's not just that the company themselves is saying we did this. They're able to say we did this and we're able to say, yeah, we actually checked and they did do this. They did this year. If they have the logo, they did it next year. Every year that they do it, they have our third party certification. So I do just want to underscore like coming at it from the anti-greenwashing side, that's really what we represent. On the greenwashing side, I would say there's like an enormous spectrum. I think for a lot of people, a lot of companies, the intent is there. They just, haven't necessarily thought through what, exactly the example you gave of like, yeah, that's okay, but you don't actually get to have the huge halo for doing that. That really isn't quite sufficient. I think probably that I would put in the category of, hey, they should become members because they want to move in the right direction. They just like, it's a great opportunity to sort of learn and do more and have that opportunity. I think the more egregious is saying you're doing something that you're actually not doing. And unfortunately, there is some of that too, or giving the appearance of doing something that you're not doing. So there's a lot of, you're a marketer, so I'm sure you're familiar with this, but a lot of like branding twists that can make it look like a green product when really nothing has changed. Those to me are the more kind of egregious ones that are more sneaky.
Yeah, you paint it green.
Yeah, exactly. You put a leaf on it.
Yeah, put a leaf on it and paint it green. It's got to be something,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
Exactly. So give me the ones who are not doing enough and let's talk to them because I think oftentimes they might want to do more or they might realize or, who knows, whatever they'll realize, but I think there's more opportunity there. But one other thing I'll just mention is there's also been somewhat of a phenomenon in response to greenwashing of a term called green hushing, that there's almost a paralysis by the people who actually are doing real things, whether we think it's enough or not, but of like, oh, I don't want to get hammered for greenwashing, so I'm just not going to say anything. And that's also problematic because I do think consumers have an interest in knowing how they can allocate their dollars to brands that are doing something. We need to sort of, I believe in the power of effective certifications to, verify that brands are doing what they're saying they're doing. So I would encourage like looking at those certifications. But at the same time, I do think when companies say nothing, even if they're doing a lot, that's a missed opportunity for those companies, because I think generally consumers would like to know, and if given the choice, will spend their dollars on solutions that they care about if they can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you provide storytelling materials? How does it you know if you're on the inside of a company, let's say that you then are doing a lot of good work around plastic pollution. You're donating to Five Gyres, for example, which is a nonprofit that I love, and I saw that they're in the network of 1% for the planet. Anna and Marcus are friends of mine, and they, so you're a brand and you want to figure out how to best tell a story around the fact that you're giving money to these guys. Will you rely on the nonprofit for those storytelling materials, or do you provide any guidance for the brand on how they can fit that into their marketing in a cohesive way? How does it work from the time when the money exchanges hands to when the story gets to be told?
Yeah, and that's like the fun moment. And we do. We definitely support that. We like for Earth Month, we provide, assets and kind of frameworks. So we do some targeted kind of campaign opportunities, but just on a more sort of general organic basis, we do provide support and guidance. And I would say our kind of key guidance is the power of the partnership story, because the way we see things is that each of the partners, the company and the nonprofit, have power in different forms, power or currency in different forms. The companies are able to provide dollars, in-kind donations, volunteer time. The nonprofits are doing the work on the ground and providing impact and are able to report on that impact. That's their currency. And it's really important to us that the stories aren't kind of lopsided, that the company's not saying, hey, we did this, when in fact they did this thing in a great partnership. So the core of our model are these partnership stories. So we really invite members in, and it's usually not a hard sell, because it's like these nonprofit partners are incredible. And when the partnerships are the right partnerships, there's such a kind of mutual respect and kind of exchange, that the storytelling that's centered around how they worked together and what resulted from that is the big opportunity.
How would you navigate a conversation? I'll put my founder's hat on again. Let's say that I'm the founder of a clothing company that's growing, and we sell all across America. We are very much not a left of center company. And I'm worried that if the phrase climate change shows up anywhere across our marketing, we're going to lose half of our customer base. Personally, I've been in the environmental movement a long time. I also am an avid hunter, and I think that a lot of what causes disagreements around between the left and the right are simple word choices. Like people left of center use environmentalism, people right of center use conservation, people left of center use climate change, but you can swap that word out for pollution, and all of a sudden it's not alienating to most people, because a lot of people in the Bible Belt have kids with asthma, so it really is, the way that I think about this a lot is around word choices and framing around what ultimately, if you're human who breathes, like ultimately want, like you want to be able to breathe clean air, drink clean water, like those are not divisive issues, but because of various political think tanks, they have become divisive issues, and there is a real danger in marketing anything with words like environmental, words like climate change, if your customer base is right of center. So how would you engage me as a founder if I have that fear?
Yeah, I would say great to have those questions, and that you've come to the right place. 1% for the Planet has a really diverse set of members and nonprofits, and work very hard to, be part of the work to make the environment a nonpartisan issue. We really believe that. And so we have, nonprofits that would kind of be aligned more in the hunting and fishing crowd. We have nonprofits that do use the word climate. And the beauty of the 1% for the Planet model is that we're aligned under the logo, the brand of 1% for the Planet, which is a big tent. But then each member differentiates based on their particular giving choices. So you as a member would absolutely be able to, pursue the partnerships that are the best fit for you. And for us, it really comes down to like what we want to see happening across our network is values-driven work. If in one community, the conversation is more around resilient communities. In another community, it's like more directly around, sea level rise related to climate change. That's okay. The key is that there's work that's meaningfully happening in these 4 impact areas, which I can say them again, or you'll recall, we don't use the word climate change there. We don't, we really try to be just plain spoken and clear about what needs to happen on the ground. What are we striving for? We're striving for resilient communities, for just economies, for, equal access, rights to nature, and for conservation and restoration. So those were very intentional. And I agree with you. I think language really matters to the extent that it can sometimes be a sort of blocking maneuver to the values, and what we really want to get at is values-driven work.
How do you engage with a nonprofit that is underperforming? I think one fear among a lot of people who maybe are interested in philanthropy, they want to see a future world exist for their grandkids, and they understand that nonprofits serve this really key function of getting things done that do not necessarily have the market can't hold it, right? There are things like having a clean river that have inherent value, but you could probably make more money in the short term if you turn that into a strip mine. And nonprofits and various government regulations are the only wall we have up against rapacious capitalism. So I mean, I think that a lot of people understand the inherent value that nonprofits bring to the world, and if we didn't have the nonprofit model, we would be living in a dramatically different world. I think there's also a fear of inefficiency, that the money that I give to a nonprofit is not going to actually get much done. How do you vet nonprofits that are low performing, and have you had to cut off nonprofits in the past that don't seem like they are effective?
Yeah, it's an important question, and it's one of the values that that brings companies to 1% for the Planet is, can you help me to find nonprofits I can trust? Because that can be a hard thing to do. So, our kind of top of the funnel vetting is quite rigorous. So by the time they're even approved, most of them perform pretty well. And I just want to put a pin in that because I want to come back to that, because I think understanding what it means to perform well is an important thing to distinguish. But like if we do find, and it's usually a company would give us feedback like, hey, this did not work out. And then we receive that feedback. We'll talk to that nonprofit, and sort of depending on the nature of what happened, we may deactivate them. We may just, educate them about what they need to do differently. And sometimes that company will continue to work with them and they'll like mend it. So it really kind of varies depending on what the performance deficit was. But sort of back to the, kind of how do we determine performance? I do think there's, and I've been in the nonprofit space for 30 plus years, and I continue to be a little like vexed and puzzled by this, that there is a tendency to have expectations of nonprofits that are either less clear or a much higher bar than we put on many companies that we comfortably invest lots of money in. So there's an interesting thing there. So we try to be really careful of like, let's understand what are the issues for, in what ways are nonprofits performing, not performing? What does that look like? In many cases, nonprofits are doing a ton with very little resources. And so were they able to respond to your email in 72 hours? Maybe not, but that's maybe because they were out, on a beach cleanup for 5 days with a company of volunteers, and they don't have someone else to respond to the email because no one will give them funding for, quote, overhead, which is actually for staff time to respond to emails. That's just an example. And I'm not, defending. There are nonprofits that underperform, just like there are companies and individuals that underperform or don't deliver or are inefficient. But what we really try to do is remain really clear-eyed on what is the impact that the nonprofit is delivering on, what is their capacity. So we really try to help companies decide, like, this nonprofit is this big, tiny, this big. So this is what they can deliver and this is what they can't deliver. If you're looking for something different, you need to sort of go elsewhere. So we really try and help companies to like make that decision. And usually what we find is when we get that best fit right, it works really well. So
let's talk more about the expectations that we hold on nonprofits and the norms around pay. So as an example, let's say I found out that the director of a nonprofit was making $300,000 a year. I think a lot of people would be like, that's crazy. That's too much. Da, da, da. If I were to tell you that the chief marketing officer at a mid-sized company was making $300,000 a year, people would say, yeah, you need the talent, right? How are you going to get the best brains in the room without competitive pay? Given your experience in the nonprofit, do you think that it's crazy that we hold these nonprofits to this this standard, and that we actually, there is a cultural norm that we get mad about those employees getting paid too much, and then wonder why so many people jump ship to the private sector so that they can set themselves up and have a career where they can make lots of money.
Yeah, I do. And I think, I think that like if you logically play it out, a nonprofit leader, a nonprofit senior staff member, any nonprofit staff member, they don't get access to different rent. Their food doesn't cost less.
Yeah.
So it doesn't, it doesn't make sense, particularly when you look at, this isn't just about like there's an incremental difference in pay. In many cases, nonprofits, particularly the smaller nonprofits, they're barely able to or not able to afford rent or housing in the area where they're working. So to me, like, there's just a logical element of it that makes me want to say, hey, like, passion does not pay the rent. Passion does not pay for your kids' clothing. So yes, nonprofits benefit from having the sort of value of getting to believe in what you do, but that fades and can often, go sour when you feel so significantly undervalued. So I think it's a really important issue. I think on the other end of the spectrum, there's some like just out of whack overpayment on the other side. So we don't need to like go to that level. But I do think funders, and, I think there are more of them, but there needs to be continuing education, who are aware that, back to that performance issue, like, you want high performers doing this critical work in the area where there's not yet a market. That's why the nonprofit exists. It's not a market resource thing. So the funders need to recognize that if we want the best work done there by the best talent, we got to make the financial piece of a larger package, because there are a lot of other pieces to it. But, that really does have to work. And again, I really appreciate the funders who see that. And I look forward to, and I'm always happy to talk to any other funders who want to have what in my mind is just like a super logical set of connections made that make it really sensible of like, pay a fair wage and pay for talent and get great results. And it all works.
Yeah. I want to drill into this a little bit more, the psychology of money among people who do good in the world. So I grew up in a very activisty family. I got involved in documentary film as a teenager, started making short docs about plastic pollution and coal power, and was kind of like this youth environmentalist dude, like won the Brower Youth Award, the Peter Benchley Blue Vision Award. I was very much like on track in that Berkeley world. Down with the man, down with capitalism, like didn't really understand the way money worked on any kind of comprehensive level because I was, a teenager. But I think that it's very normal for younger folks to care about the world on an inherent spiritual level. And I think that there is maybe a conflation that happens on that logic track where you start to believe that money is bad. Because there are issues with capitalism without any guardrails on, like therefore money is bad. Like we don't really need money. Money is not that important in the scheme of things. Like, and it becomes this philosophy that would get someone like me to accept not a lot of money just because my relationship with it is like, money is this bad, evil thing. Since then, I've really, one of the reasons why I love marketing, why I love being in the for-profit space is that I think businesses are an incredible vehicle to change the world. You're not necessarily just shouting about the bad, but you can, in the best cases, create products that make the bad obsolete. And I love the energy of well-run businesses. Like on a spiritual level, I think that to be able to solve problems, come at something with a group and try and make something better is a really beautiful way to spend your time here on Earth. And some of those people are able to get fabulously wealthy because of that. And I think that they deserve to. What would you say to, let's say, a class of 16-year-olds who were very much on board with saving the Earth, but sort of believed that money was the root of all evil?
Yeah. Wow. That would be an awesome conversation. And I have two children who are a little older than that. But, we have had money conversations. And, I think about this all the time because, 1% for the planet is essentially proof positive that you can, within the system, leverage some different rules to move money differently. And so for me, that's kind of the overarching framework that I bring to it is that we are in a capitalist system and there's actually some latitude within that to do things differently. And when you start thinking that way, you can start to see money differently. So that's like one premise I would bring to it is, get clear on like the role that money plays in the system that you're in and build an understanding of, what's the flexibility within that so that you can, because I think there's kind of a fun revolutionary feel of playing within the system differently, using the system differently, and gaining what you want from it in the sense of values for planet and people. So to me, that's really important. And again, 1% for the planet is like a model that's based on that. In terms of just like going a little deeper into, just kind of, like a question that would come to mind for me related to what you're saying is, do philanthropists have disproportionate power? They maybe earned their money in ways that were the result of some damage, and now they're giving back. And because they have a lot of money, they're able to decide what they give back to and what's kind of off with that. And, I have that at the tip of my tongue because I think about that a lot. And I do think where I, come down on that is the best thing that we can do at any moment in time is to direct resources to the things that we most care about. Um, you know, there's, certainly lines that we would draw of where that money could come from. But, if there's a philanthropist, business or nonprofit in good standing, it's not sort of ill-gotten gains in in a sort of legal sense, much better in my mind. And I know there are people who would probably take a different stance, but much better in my mind if we can direct those resources towards places that need them and things that we care about. And and then in the process for those 16-year-olds, I'd ask them to think about, like, what do you want to do all day? That's always my sort of key question. If what you want to do all day is the work on the ground to, drive change, then do that and get good at figuring out how you attract resources to that. If what you want to do is build those resources in the commercial sector, that's great. Make sure that you have a sort of ethical compass while you're doing that. And then think about, like, if you have things you care about, how are you going to direct those resources? That's a big oversimplification, but I think ultimately trying to kind of, and it certainly would be more than one classroom conversation with 16-year-olds, but to sort of demystify money and really reframe it as currency that can make things happen.
Mhm.
And then think about kind of where you want to be in terms of how that currency is generated, allocated, and implemented.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great framing on it. I would I would also take it one step further, that if you happen to be the person who becomes fabulously wealthy, one of the only ways to not go insane is to see yourself as a conduit and give some of those resources away. From a few of the people who I know who have had that happen to them, the ones that are the most well adjusted and sort of grounded are the ones who have been able to redirect those resources, and not see themselves as gods, but rather as conduits.
I think that's such a great point. And I guess if I can add just one more thing on that, I think it's really important, and I think this probably underlies or is part of the makeup of those people who are able to see themselves as conduits, is that they have a concept of enough. And I think that's a very important thing to say, because I think that's something we've kind of lost sight of, and that is like, we get to have a boundary in capitalism if we choose to, and that boundary can be enough. And it's going to be different math for everyone, but I think we can probably agree there are a lot of people who are way beyond what's enough. And there's a lot of people who are way below what's enough. And if we, if it's much harder if you don't have enough to sort of try and get there. Whereas if you do have more than enough, like, you actually absolutely could identify enough. And I was at a great panel last year, actually, about the topic of ownership that you brought up earlier. And one of the principals of a company who had shifted into an employee ownership model said the key was him and his fellow founder realizing, like, we have enough. We have enough. We are good. And so we can shift into this model and start allocating more of the resources to the employees. And it was, like, beautiful, brilliant. And it was, interestingly, not like a company that you'd see from the outside looking in and saying, oh, that's a sustainable company. It was just a, pretty regional company doing good work and having been successful. But that key concept of enough, I think, is super important.
Yeah, it's man, it's so funny too, because it is very possible to feel like you're living luxuriously for practically nothing. Like, go get the $50 electric massager and put it on your couch, and all of a sudden you're going to be in more pleasure than you could be if you maybe got something for $1 million. But, like, one of my favorite thought experiments to do is to ask myself the question, what are things in my life that can make me feel like I'm living luxuriously for cheap? And just to put that prism on comfort, I think is really healthy, because without that, if you do start to get lots of money and your friends are also, you're in a social group where you're around people who are also gaining lots of wealth, I find easy to begin this hedonistic creep and start to equate just cost with value, which is some of the biggest snake oil salesmen I've ever seen just kind of prey on the super rich who thoughtlessly equate something that costs $100,000 with, oh well, that must have a ton of value to it, when really you could get it for $100 somewhere else. But they're kind of preying on that psychology of people who have lots of money and are not questioning the value of things or what they even really like.
I think that's a great point, and it actually ties to, it's something else I would say to the 16-year-olds is, really be disciplined in constantly checking in on what's the value of money. To sort of understand, because I do think, that that's a key to sort of understanding what's enough, to then being able to understand, a sense of kind of connection to things larger than yourself, which you can then invest in or give to.
Sure. I am a fan of a group that you may be aware of called Giving What We Can. Or do you know about these guys? So they are a group that really are trying to change the norms of philanthropy among the wealthy. There's a philosopher, big podcaster named Sam Harris, who is involved in Giving What We Can. And he talks a lot about this. That basically the idea is that you give 10% of your wealth every year to giving what you can, and they redirect it to nonprofits. I think kind of, but one thing that he talks about quite often is that we need to change the norms of philanthropy among the very wealthy. Because on a percentage base, if you are a billionaire, you could be giving, a few $100,000 or even $1 million, and that seems like a lot of money to most people. But really, the norms of giving among that mega upper echelon are quite a bit lower than a lot of other classes of people. Have you thought about this at all? Do you have any kind of perspective around how we change the norms of philanthropy among the super rich?
I mean, I mostly think about it in terms of like, if everyone gave 1%,
Yeah.
just to, and we did have an individual member program for a while. We've shifted into this Planet Impact Fund to create a sort of different way to manage that. But so I do think about it, and I think, one of I guess the key thing, a couple of key things. One is, to your point around sort of peers, I do think there's data on, like, people are looking at what their peers are doing. So, any of us are sort of comparing ourselves to our peer group and generally thinking we're lesser than, which, then when you kind of, if anyone were to zoom back, it's like, you're good.
Yeah.
You're just fine. And so I do think that's a challenge, because I think that, the higher up you get in our sort of income stratosphere, the more insulated you are from reality. So I do think it's a challenge to influence that group. That said, I think, some of the things like the Giving Pledge and things like that, or just like really good, examples of Mackenzie Scott. I think she did a really powerful job of giving at a really significant level, being very thoughtful about it. And so I do think holding up those examples, all of that said, I think.
Is that Jeff Bezos's ex-wife?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
Yep. Sorry for just dropping that. But yeah, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but she gave a significant amount away, and again, in really thoughtful ways, and in like appropriate chunks, and with a lot of like respect for those she was giving to. So, I do think that that's super important. I think what I most think about is, again, back to the 1% model, how can we make a system change within the capitalist system that creates a reallocation of resources kind of before it's kind of pulled out of those companies and into the hands of the wealthy few. And really that's what 1% for the Planet is trying to do. I think that's what the increasing number of employee ownership and sort of alternative ownership models are trying to do, is saying, hey, we can focus on that. And we do need people to focus on that, sort of the actions and philanthropy of the super wealthy. And we have a huge opportunity to also focus on how can we reallocate those resources, in the marketplace more. And to me, I'm a little more interested in that just because that's the space I'm working in. And I feel like I have more influence on that. And I also think there's a ton of power in that, because if 1% right now, last year we certified $100 million in giving, which is, a big number, but it's also not a big number, sort of to your point of understanding the math. And that's, on a sort of fraction of a percent of the total kind of commercial exchange in any given year. As we grow that, which we are doing, the more we can we're essentially building in, you pay your staff, you pay your rent, you pay your taxes, you pay the planet. It's built in. It becomes part of how resources are reallocated. And it's much more strategic, because I think when companies are really thinking through how they're giving, and then it often leads to, and I imagine you've kind of seen this in some of the other storytelling work that you've done, that there's this dynamic that starts to, emerge as you do that and see the results from that. It's well, if we're doing that over here, we should probably address this over here as well. And so we see these broader systems changes that extend beyond the sort of reallocation of capital and into just sort of how people are overall operating the businesses. There's a ton of work for us to do there. I don't want to imply that we're there yet, but truly, what we have and what we have the opportunity to do through 1% and, some other models that are out there is, at the level before the wealth accumulates in the hands of the few, to really allocate it differently.
It also creates a more sustainable funding mechanism, theoretically, because the money can be going to the nonprofits year over year rather than just counting on the generous whim of a mega wealthy person who is just in a good mood one January and decides to give $1 billion. That's really not a sustainable way to get good work done. If you are I have a lot of friends who are professional surfers who often will be on 1-year contracts with their companies that pay their rent, pay their food, and they don't know until the end of December if they're going to get re-signed by that company. So what that does then, right, is it makes it so you can't really count on your future in any kind of realistic way. And same thing if you're the director of a nonprofit and you don't know if that money's going to come in next year, you can't count on that. It's really hard to get good work done. We all know kind of the compounding impact of habits and repetition, and I think that also applies to change making. It's very hard to get something huge done in 1 year. I'm sure as you've seen, these are 5, 10, 20-year endeavors to actually create the kind of sustainable, resilient communities that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the roles that we get to play is, we don't mandate that companies give for X number of years to a certain nonprofit, but we are able to say, hey, here's best practices, give in unrestricted ways to nonprofits that are a best fit for you and commit to them for more than a year.
Right.
If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, and you get to make that decision, but make that commitment. And then what's really cool is that then, back to what I was saying before about that kind of equal level of power and exchange of currency, is that when those relationships work and are lasting, not only does the nonprofit benefit from a more reliable, sustained source of income, but they also are able to say, hey, as we've gotten to know you, we've noticed this. Can we give you some insights on this? And so there's often then gains for both sides that exceed the dollar value of what's exchanged.
Sure.
And that's that's like not insignificant value, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, founders tend to be very smart people, and they can, if they can offer a piece of structural advice to a nonprofit, like it's running any business or any nonprofit is really hard just from an organizational standpoint. So yeah, I could absolutely see that kind of that kind of thoughtful brain accumulation being very significant.
Yeah. And the other way too, because we'll have
Totally, yeah.
nonprofits that will say, hey, like, great that you're giving to us over here and we're addressing some of your plastic issues, but we noticed over there that you could be doing this differently. And that's like light bulb for that company. So it's like this awesome
For
exchange.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that within any organization, it's really easy to have it turn into kind of an echo chamber of ideas. You're surrounded within a culture, and this is really one reason, on a basic level, why creative agencies tend to work so well. If you look at a company like Nike, people think like, oh, all the best ideas must be coming from within Nike. All these great creative commercials. Just Do It was a line that came from a creative agency called Wyden and Kennedy. Most big ideas, I would argue, come from outside the organization, and tend to come from someone who cares about what you're doing but is a little bit further away from it. The line that a lot of agencies use is, you can't see your label from inside the bottle. And I think that similarly, whether it be from a company or a nonprofit standpoint, having smart people who are in your corner but a little bit further away from the problems that you're trying to solve can be way valuable beyond just a dollar amount.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's true in our personal lives too, isn't it?
Totally. Yeah.
Sometimes we need people to see
I
those
know.
things about us.
Yeah. It's like trying to describe your own personality.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's a really important point.
I wanted to have you drill in just quickly on what you meant by Mackenzie donating in really thoughtful ways. So I've heard a little bit about this, that it was very much, it was kind of like, you can do what you need with this money. Was there anything that I'm missing there around like what you felt like was so great about the structure of those donations?
Yeah, I appreciate that because I think that's an important point to like emphasize. And I don't know if she was technically using this model, but there's a concept called trust-based philanthropy, which the kind of core principles of it are that the recipient is the knowledgeable party about the work that they're doing. The funder is not the knowledgeable party. They are the funder. And so, at one level that sounds like, well, of course, that's the case. I think to a lot of what we've been talking about in this conversation, like a lot of times the power that accrues to someone with a lot of wealth can create an assumption that they are not only the funder, but the knowledgeable party.
Yeah.
And so they come in and direct, I want these dollars to go here for this and not there. And I think the kind of core of the idea of trust-based philanthropy, or what I would just say is like good philanthropy, is do your homework, like make sure that you understand who you're giving to and that they're capable of doing the, work and all of that kind of stuff. But then let them make the operational decisions about how they allocate the money. And my understanding, and I haven't been super close to this process, but from what I've read about Mackenzie Scott, is she and her team did a great job of doing the homework, finding the organizations and understanding what they're doing, but then kind of stopping at the right point and saying, okay, here's the money. You make the decisions about how to allocate it to the work that we have vetted to know that you are capable of doing. So I think that to me is the key.
Yeah. I have a friend who he's a very well-renowned spear fisherman, and he does these private tours sometimes with very wealthy people. And I once asked him, I was like, is there a type that is most dangerous to take diving? Spearfishing is a very, very dangerous sport. He said basically the wealthier they are, the more dangerous they are. Because they tend to just think that they have it all figured out. So I like the story about Mackenzie Scott. There's a great book called The Psychology of Money by a guy named Morgan Housel. Have you heard of Morgan Housel?
Mm-hmm.
He's great, but one of the tenets that he talks about in the book is humility. He says, just from we tend to separate psychology and money. I think in ways that is we shouldn't, and he talks about it as like humility is a primary tenet of both wealth accumulation and also wealth management, and knowing how to act well with that money. He
Mm-hmm.
has a great line where he says, if you see someone with a $100,000 car, all you know is that they're $100,000 poorer than they were before they had before they got that car. But yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the common denominator among this around this conversation could be boiled down to humility and being
Mm-hmm.
able to act well with wealth in humble ways, and we do see those examples again and again in the world, and I think that these are people who will be celebrated for a long time to come, and I hope that it becomes more of the norm amidst a stratified culture, and I just want that pot to grow even bigger and bigger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an important point. Another book that I don't agree with all of it, but is Winners Take All. Have
Mm.
you heard of that by Anand Girard Haradas? I apologize if I'm
Yeah, I've heard of it.
mispronouncing the
I've
name.
not read it.
It's super interesting. There are parts of it that I'm not completely with, but he does bring up some really interesting points about what I think is the most key point that he brings up is there's some like fundamental, like structural challenges for these philanthropists, because a lot of times what enabled them to get to the role and position that they're in is due to some structural inequalities. Like that's,
Mhm.
I think we could probably all agree on that. So sometimes they're loath to make donations that might change the system.
Hmm.
They want reforms, but they don't necessarily want reforms that would change the system that got them to where that they are. So I think, it's a little bit of a wonkier take on it, but I do think it's important to think about that just to sort of understand the psychology of giving and to, that I think that's a key underlying piece if we want to change any of it is to how to, think through that. And again, that brings me back to like, let's try and make the changes before it gets sort of isolated. The dollars get isolated into the hands of the very, very, very few.
Hmm.
And again, I think there's some really interesting efforts happening out there now with business leaders who are able to say, I got enough. I'm
Hmm.
doing fine. Our company is growing. How can I met this one awesome woman from Carrie Siggins from Stone Age, which is a relatively small company in Durango, Colorado. But her mission is to grow 1,000 millionaires on her staff. So she has this employee ownership model, and she wants to have, on an annual basis, just continue to have the success of the company accrue to those people doing the work.
Mm. Yeah, it's beautiful. I'm so happy that this conversation, it started with environmental philanthropy and it's kind of ending with psychology, because I do think that those are the changes that need to be made for those good decisions to be made. So I'm really happy that you're thinking about it on such a basic level. Are there any books that you would recommend for the audience to be able to go further down this track? You recommended Winner Take All. Anything else that you think would be good to further this conversation for people in their own minds?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like a lot of the psychology stuff I haven't really like found a book on, but one book that I do find interesting is What If We Get It Right by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, which, just has, the sort of fundamental psychology shift of like, hey, it's very easy to tell a super negative story about our, sort of prospects as a planet
Mm,
right now, but like what if we get it right? And in fact, the only way we get it right is if we think that we might get it right.
yep.
And, that that I think is really important. So she's a great writer, so I would definitely recommend that. And I do think, I'm also glad that we went the psychology route because to me, a lot of what we're, pretty much our whole conversation has been about that. Because really thinking about like, how do you get a company to say it's in our best interest to take, 1% off our top line and allocate it, make another investment with that, it's a big deal. And so the way we think about it, and, I love that we went into like structural change and capitalism and all that, but really is to think about like, take a step this year, do 1% this year, 1 year, we'll certify it, we'll help you tell the story of it, we'll help you find your partners, and then you'll become part of a community, and then, and it grows from there. And I do think for most of us, and you mentioned the, power of habits earlier, I really, I think that's such a powerful concept because we need to sort of start identifying as people who do
Yep.
XYZ, and we need to start like building a practice. And, that's a lot of what 1% for the planet is. And we're a great example of how that adds up to pretty significant change at scale.
Yeah. You could write a book called The Habits of Giving.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the world's really ripe for this idea that philanthropy could be made a habit, and ultimately that becomes part of your identity, and then it's unstoppable. Yeah, I to your point, I just want to linger on this before we close down the podcast because I think it's so important, and it really is beyond what we've spoken about regarding low pay in some of these sectors. I think that one really dangerous theme that gets a lot of people to jump ship from dedicating their lives to the betterment of the environment, to society, is the negativity. Is just that it is a culture of complaining about the problems. And that can be so corrosive for people's brains. And I think that there's to your point, you really cannot get to a better future without having a vision for what that better future is. And you also can't galvanize a lot of people to be able to make that possible. I think that a lot of, my day job is copywriter, and I think a lot of people just see that as like, oh, you're writing these like glib little ads and taglines and that kind of thing. But it's a deeply psychological career. And there's one of my favorite books on copywriting is called Junior by Thomas Kemeny, and he says the telltale sign of an average copywriter is that they start with a negative headline. So the headline is your toilet's broken and the water's spraying everywhere. It's like, how can you shift that into the clean bathroom? And to how it's like the idea, like, people don't buy a drill, they buy a 6-inch hole. So shifting your communication as an advertiser, as a marketer, towards painting the picture of the future you want, is a really powerful change in the way we talk about this, but I think ultimately can keep a lot of those best people in the movement because it feels good to be a part of.
Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. And, that's been a really important part of our internal conversation at 1% over the last couple of months. And, really where we're coming out strong is, in this moment in the world, we were built for this. Because that's the truth of 1% for the planet, is we were built as a movement builder, regardless of what's going on the planet. So that's one piece. So we absolutely have a kind of positive urgency orientation, which doesn't mean we don't see the hard things, but I think you're absolutely right. It's about, lighting the path to where we want to go. And then one thing I also think about is, kind of whether you start from a negative or a positive standpoint, to what end? And the end is today, because 10 years ago, we were worried about 2025 in some way, right? But we were hopeful that we would be having interesting conversations and doing meaningful work. And so let's have interesting conversations and do meaningful work and, be kind to people around us and care deeply about the things around us, because then we are in the process of looking ahead. We're creating a better future than what we were worried about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So to me, that is just a super important step to take, which, runs the risk of sometimes people saying like, how can you be optimistic in the face of XYZ? But I truly believe that if we aren't, then we'll never have any opportunity. It's the only way to get forward.
Yeah, I would take it a step further and say it's less about optimism or pessimism and more about persuasive strategies. Because it
Yeah.
doesn't matter what your cause is, you need to persuade people, and there are ways of communication that are more or less persuasive. And I can tell you don't want to hang out with a dude who's a bummer at the party. That dude's not persuading many people.
Right.
So yeah, I think that is a way that I continue to learn and continue to see that there are that is a cultural change that I think is happening, and I want to see more of. If a nonprofit thought of their cause as just a product that they were selling, what is the most persuasive strategy to sell that product? I think would be a really valuable question to be asking more.
Yeah. Yeah. I think showcase the solutions, don't describe the problems, because most people are intimate with the problems.
Yep.
So what they want to know is like, how can we solve this? Yeah. I think that's a really important point.
Great. Well, this was so much fun. Kate Williams, where can people learn more about the work that you do?
1%fortheplanet.org, all spelled out in letters. Go there, check it out. You can learn more about membership, about our Planet Impact Fund. We have a great blog, so lots of stories about the partnerships that I mentioned. We're also pretty active on LinkedIn, both 1% for the Planet, and you can find me at Kate Williams. And I also do respond to messages on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out.
All right. Kate, this was so much fun. Thanks for the good work you're doing. The persuasive work
Thank
that
you.
you're doing.
Thank you. Great conversation.